Hello, welcome to Psalm 5 Bible study. Thank you for your patience in time for me to get ready to do this. It's been a fun process for me. If you didn't see the post that I made a few days ago asking for patience, what I said was that my goal for this is to really go as in depth as I can with these Psalms before I give them to you as a devotional. My goal is not to overwhelm you with information, but just to bring insights to the surface that are easy to understand that you might not see if you were to read it yourself, or that I wouldn't see if I was to read it for myself um, the first time. I wouldn't have noticed it. So these do take some time. My Bible is covered in scratch all over it from me taking notes and different things. So, having said all that, let's get into Psalm 5. I will be reading out of the New American Standard. And so, let me go ahead and read the whole thing, all 12 verses of Psalm 5. It says, "Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Heed the sound of my cry for help, my King and my God. For to you I pray. In the morning, O Lord, you will hear my voice. In the morning I will order my prayer to you and eagerly watch. For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all who do iniquity. You destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the man of bloodshed and deceit. But as for me, by your abundant loving kindness I will enter your house. At your holy temple I will bow in reverence to you, for you. O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Hold them guilty, O God. By their own devices let them fall. In the multitude of their transgressions thrust them out, for they are rebellious against you. But let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy, and you may shelter them, and may you shelter them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For it is you who blesses the righteous man, O Lord. You surround him with favor as with a shield. So that's Psalm 5. It's the longest one we've done so far. So let's go through it verse at a time. So, verse 1, "Give ear to my words, O Lord, consider my groaning." In the Hebrew, and I just point these out because I think it's valuable to see the poetry, although the English rendition that you have written is a little more easy to understand if you're just reading it. But verse 1 reads literally, "To my words, O Lord, consider my groaning." And that word groaning, we don't usually think of our prayers as groaning. When we think of groaning, we just think of like, something like that. But this word can mean a lot of different things. It can mean groaning, it can mean sighing, it can mean loud breathing. Basically, it's a word that is making a sound from your mouth that's not talking. So either a sigh or all the way to a groan. Ugh. It's something like that. Um, I think some translations even translate it sighing. But uh, the psalmist, who is David here, is calling out to God, saying, "Listen to what I have to say, but what I have to say is just a groan. I can't even verbalize it." And that's something that we certainly have an understanding of. We've all gone through times in our life when we didn't really know how to pray and we didn't know what to say, but we just do our best, and it kind of comes out as a groan. And that's what he's talking about here in verse 1. Verse 2, "Heed the sound of my cry for help, my King and my God, for to you I pray." So he's in his groaning, although he's obviously actually verbalizing because there are words here in the psalm, but the emotion comes from the fact that he needs help. Who does he need help from? He doesn't say right away. In fact, it's not until verses 5 and 6 and then verse 9 that we hear about who he needs help from. But he's praying. He's praying out to God, his God and his King. And it's notable that he says, "My King and my God," because David is the King of Israel. And so David, the King of Israel, is praying to God and calling him the King. So this is an extraordinary display of humility that David, as the King, would say to God, "God, you are the King." Verse 3, "In the morning, O Lord, you will hear my voice. In the morning I will order my prayer to you and eagerly watch." This is one of those verses that if you just read it in English, you're like, okay, talking about prayer. There's some, so let's walk through it. In the morning, O Lord, you will hear my voice. So that will is a present tense, and so it's almost like he's setting an appointment. It's like he's praying in the moment, but he's saying, God, this isn't the end of our conversation. I'm also going to pray to you in the morning, so be ready for that. And he says, in the morning, I will order my prayer to you and eagerly watch. Well, if you look closely at verse 3, you'll see that the words my prayer are in italics, which means they are added by the translators. They're not in the original language. In fact, the Hebrew just reads, in the morning I will organize to you and watch. And that word organize isn't used a lot in the Old Testament, but when it is used of arranging a sacrifice, getting the wood ready to light it on fire on the altar to give a sacrifice to God. So it is preparing to pray. So what David is saying is, hey, God, in the morning, I'm going to get a sacrifice ready for you, and I'm going to offer a sacrifice to you, and then I'm going to pray to you then. And then, verse 3, at the end of it, eagerly watch. And like a watchman, he's going to watch and see what happens. And when I see this, I think of Elijah on Mount Carmel, when Elijah had the face-off with the prophets of Baal, and he built an altar and poured all the water on it and all these things, and waited for God to bring down fire and consume the sacrifice. He was waiting to see God's response to his prayer and his altar. And likewise, David here is saying, hey, God, in the morning, I am going to prepare an altar and I'm going to pray to you, and then I'm going to watch and see what happens, God. So that's the plan. He's making a prayer appointment with God. And here's why he's doing that. Verse 4. For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. No evil dwells with you. The first half of that is pretty self-explanatory. God doesn't take pleasure in wickedness. Then no evil dwells with you. This dwelling can also mean sojourning. Sojourning is an old word that means, when I think of it, I think of like hitchhiking. That's not what they would have thought of it as then. But sojourning is you're traveling, and because of the way travel was back then, obviously they didn't have cars and trains and airplanes. Um, so they would travel, they'd load up their camels or donkeys or whatever, they'd travel as far as they could, or maybe to the next town, and then they would stay there for a couple weeks, resupply, rest, let their animals rest, do another couple weeks, rest, get more supplies, let their animals rest, do a couple more weeks. That was sojourning. And so while you were waiting for that week or two, you would be a sojourner. And hospitality was very important in that culture because everybody had to travel, and the only way to travel was to sojourn. And so the culture, the hospitality was very important across all cultures because this was kind of a universal thing that they all did. But God does not let evil dwell with him. He doesn't let evil sojourn with him. So the imagery here is that hospitality is very important. We always let the sojourners stay with us. But God, if someone evil wants to come stay with God for a little while, God says, no, sir, you get out of here. That God does not abide evil temporarily. He doesn't even let them stick around for a little while. That's what he's saying in verse 4. Verse 5, the boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all who do iniquity. And again, the literal arrangement of that verse, they shall not stand, the boastful, before your eyes. You hate all who do iniquity. Standing before your eyes, this is a common phrase. It's expressed a couple different ways in the Old Testament, but it's very common to speak of being before the eyes of the Lord, or being before the face of the Lord, or being before the Lord generically. And what that means is you're being in God's presence. And we know that you cannot be in God's presence if you're not holy. And to be in God's presence is a great privilege. And so he's saying in verse 5, the boastful, they don't get to stand before you. They don't get to be in your presence, God. He hates all who do iniquity. And then verse 6, you destroy those who speak falsehood. The Lord abhors the man of bloodshed and deceit. Or the man of bloodshed and deceit is abhorred by the Lord, is the arranging. So God hates these people who are boasting, who are sinning, they're speaking falsehood, and they're deceiving, and all of that leads to bloodshed. These are people who only care about themselves, they're boastful, they are willing to say anything, they don't care about the truth, and they don't care who dies. They're men of bloodshed. God hates them. Verse 7. But as for me, now David speaks of himself, but as for me, by your abundant loving kindness I will enter your house. At your holy temple I will bow in reverence of you. So David has been talking about the evil one, but now he's going to talk about himself. And he can come before the Lord. Remember verse 5. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. The boastful cannot be in the presence of God. But who can? David. David can be in the Lord's house, and he can bow before the Lord. Why? Because he's a great person? Because he's done such great things? Maybe because he's the king of Israel? No. It's by your abundant loving kindness. And there are two things I need to make points on both of those words. The word loving kindness is the Hebrew word chesed, which is thankfully an Old Testament concept that is growing in Christian consciousness today. A lot of Christians today know what chesed is, God's steadfast loving kindness. He never stops loving his people. He never stops being kind to them is what that means. It's his covenant love. And because of his abundant, there's so much chesed, there's so much of God's covenant love that David can enter the house of the Lord. And so I need to point out that word abundant is the Hebrew word barov, and it's going to show up again as a comparison. So I just want to draw your attention to it right there. You can't really see it in the English, but it's very obvious in the Hebrew that and it just means the greatness of or the abundance of. By the abundance of God's covenant love, David can enter the temple of God. Verse 8. O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. I just have some alternate translations to offer here. Because I personally struggle a lot with reading language like this. O Lord, lead me in your righteousness because of my foes. Make your way straight before me. Just that language of make your way straight before me. What does that mean? A simpler way to say it is make your path straight before my face. And then, okay, well, that makes sense. I can visualize that because I've been hiking before and going down a path, and then all of a sudden this path disappears and you don't know which way to go. It would be really nice if that path would just be straight in front of your face. And that's what he's saying here. That he desires for God to make God's path straight before David so that he can walk in it. And God needs to do this because of his foes. Excuse me. Or on account of his foes, God needs to do this. So why does God need to make his ways straight before David? Because of his foes. It's because the problem he's having with his enemies is their deception and their lying all the time. That's why he's having a problem with them. And so David's concern is that he's going to fall for one of their tricks, fall for one of their lies, and then he's made a mistake and he's not walking in righteousness anymore. And so he's praying that God will keep that path of righteousness clear so he doesn't get deceived. Verse 9. There is nothing reliable in what they say. Their inward part is destruction itself. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Let me read that in language that is simpler for me to understand. There is not in their mouth anything trustworthy. Their inward parts are destruction. Like a grave is their open throat, and they flatter, and with their tongue they flatter. And this is almost like a dentist appointment or like seeing a, ear, nose, and throat, an ENT doctor. Years and years ago, I had to be scoped, right? And they stuck this little camera that was the end of a long cable thing. I don't know. They stuck it up my nose and then down my throat, and it was awful. But that's the picture of what is happening here. Is he's saying when they talk, there's nothing good in there. There's nothing trustworthy in their mouth. And if you look in their mouth, you see destruction. And it's like an open grave when they open their mouth. And with their tongue, all they do is flatter. That everything that comes out of their mouth is just bad and worthless and destructive. And that's the kind of person that he's has as his enemy right now. Verse 10, hold them guilty, O God, by their own devices let them fall. In the multitude of their transgressions thrust them out, for they are rebellious against you. So I promised you that this Hebrew word, barov, would show up again, and here it does. But hold them guilty, O God. This hold them guilty is asking God not just to declare them guilty. So when we think of our justice system, when we see the word guilty, we think of the judge saying, okay, the jury has returned their verdict, and it is guilty. Oh, okay, they're guilty. That's not the part of the judicial process that he's referring to here. He's referring to the punishment. He's saying, when he's saying hold them guilty, he's not saying, God, I hope that you declare them guilty. They are guilty. And that's the point of verses 5 and 6. God hates them. They're guilty before God already. What he's saying is, God, don't let them get away with it. You could literally translate this maybe a bit more casually. Make them pay, O God. Or make them pay for their guilt, O God. This is a reference to their punishment and asking God to hold them liable and make them suffer their consequences of their actions. Specifically, by their own devices, let them fall. That because of their deceit, because of their lying all the time and just flattering everybody to get what they want, he says, may that be the thing that causes their downfall. In the multitude of their transgressions, thrust them out. And this multitude word is that same word we saw before translated abundant. So verse 7 says, God, because of the great abundance of your covenant love, I can enter your temple. And then in verse 10, he says, because of the great multitude of their transgressions, chase them out. Chase them out of your temple or your house, or chase them out from before you is the implication. Thrust them out is kind of, I don't know. I like the translation chase better. I think that it's more of an action word. How does someone thrust? I don't know, but how does someone chase? I can understand that. By the multitude of their sins, chase them out of your house, for they are rebellious against you. And now, having said all that, David takes refuge in God and remembers God's promises and trusts in God's promises and says, but let all who take refuge in you be glad. Let them ever sing for joy, and may you shelter them, that those who love your name may exult in you. And this is another verse where I read this kind of language and my eyes just kind of glaze over, and it's like, oh, let them ever sing for joy. May you shelter them. Let me give you an equally valid translation that I relate to better. And it doesn't change the meaning. It's just a little bit more interesting words. Let all who take refuge in you rejoice. May they sing cheer forever. May you be a shelter over them, that those who love your name may praise you. This is a song about singing and about making merry and celebrating and partying. That's what this verse is about. He's saying, God, may those who take refuge in you be able to celebrate and sing and be happy because you are protection over them. This word shelter just literally means to cover up. And it's often used of a roof. The roof is the shelter, right? That God would be a roof over them or protect them from the elements, or in this case, protect them from the evil one. That he covers them, he protects them. And because they are protected by God, they can celebrate. Verse 12, for it is you who blesses the righteous man, O Lord. You surround him with favor as with a shield. And so here David is recognizing that the good things that the righteous man has come from God. It is you, God, who blesses the righteous man, as opposed to the wicked man that he's talking about here in verse 5 and 6, who is boastful and deceitful and doesn't mind killing people or doesn't mind people dying because they just like to lie. That person is trying to make their own way and get their own blessing by their own hands. And David says that's not the way of the righteous. The righteous man gets his blessing from God. And what does that blessing look like? This has been the topic all the way since Psalm 1. Psalm 1, the definition I gave you, I'm going to read so I don't mess it up. Blessedness is the joyful spiritual condition of those who are right with God and the pleasure and satisfaction that is derived from that. It's the joyful condition of being right with God. And when you're right with God, you are blessed because that gives you peace and it gives you satisfaction. Doesn't mean you have an easy life. Obviously, David is needing help from God against his enemies. Doesn't mean you're going to be rich. Doesn't mean you're going to be powerful, but it means you will have joy and peace and fulfillment in your soul because you have a right relationship with God. But we get a little bit more detail here in verse 12. The very last line, you surround him with favor as with a shield. We've seen this language of shield before, that God is like a shield around his people, that he encircles them with protection. What does that protection look like? Does it mean they're never hurt? Obviously not. Does it mean they never get sick? Obviously not. God's people get hurt. God's people get sick. Bad things happen to God's people. What does it mean? You surround him with favor, is what it says. Favor. What is favor? Favor is God's pleasure with someone. It's often used of a king, that a king bestows favor on somebody. He looks favorably upon someone. So a man goes to the king and says, "O king, I was not able to harvest enough this year to feed my family. Would you give me some granary from the royal grain silos?" And the king looks upon him with favor and says, "Yes, I look upon you with favor so you can have the grain." That it's the king's pleasure with the person. And so we are protected on all sides by God's favor, which means God is always happy with us. God is always pleased with us. When we turn to God and we speak to him, he's always happy to hear from us, and he's always happy to see us. It's never a situation where you go to God or you enter his holy temple, as it says in verse 7, and God says, "Get out of here. I don't want to talk to you today." Never happens. You're always welcome in God's temple. You're always welcome before the face of God, because we have righteousness in Christ is the new covenant. The old covenant was a little bit different in its mechanisms. But for us today, because of the righteousness we have in Jesus Christ, if we've placed our faith in him alone for our salvation, we have this same confidence that God surrounds us with favor. And so the wicked words of deceitful people cannot hurt God's people, because God's favor surrounds them. Our assurance that God smiles always upon us is a protection against the lies of evil men. I said in the announcement about this that we talk about how Christians handle evil men lying about them. That has happened as long as Jesus has been around, that evil men lie about Christ and about the faith surrounding him and about his people. How do we handle that? David had this problem. And the way we handle it is trusting that God is always pleased with us. So we don't have to worry about lies coming from the outside, because we are in the shelter of God's steadfast loving kindness. We're in the shelter of God's covenant love. That no matter what, every day he's always going to be happy to see us. He's always going to have a positive relationship with us. We're always going to be fulfilled by that relationship spiritually and eternally. So we don't have to worry about the lies that come from outside, because they don't bother us, because we know they're not true. So that's how we handle people lying about our faith, is resting in the shelter of God's love. That's the confidence that we have today, is the confidence that David had in Psalm chapter 5. So thank you all for watching. Dave, you're welcome for doing this, and I hope you all have a great day. Psalm 6, obviously, is coming up next. It's a little bit shorter, but about the same length. I actually emailed one of my old Hebrew professors, and I said, "Hey, I'm trying to do this devotional through Psalms, and it's kind of kicking my butt because my Hebrew is rustier than I wish it was." And she gave me some tips. So I've already been thankful that it's getting a little bit easier going through Psalm 5, and I think as we continue, it will get easier for me. But thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.